Melania Trump entered the upscale restaurant with quiet grace, seeking a peaceful evening away from political chaos that often surrounded her. The dim glow of chandeliers cast a golden hue over the elegant space, where Washington's elite dined in hushed conversations. She chose a secluded corner booth, her fingers tracing the edge of the menu as she absorbed the rare solitude. But her presence did not go unnoticed. Whispers floated through the air, some in awe, others laced with judgment. It was rare to see the former First Lady alone, without an entourage or security detail close by. While most diners remained respectful, one man saw an opportunity. Richard Kessler, the arrogant restaurant manager with a long-held grudge against the Trump family. Smirking, he strutted toward her table, his voice deliberately loud enough for the entire restaurant to hear. Well, he sneered. If it isn't the First Lady herself. Tell me, Melania, do you always look this lifeless, or is your husband to blame? A stunned silence filled the room before scattered laughter broke out. Some guests exchanged uneasy glances, while others chuckled, entertained by the blatant disrespect. But Melania did not flinch. Her piercing gaze met Richard's, revealing nothing, no anger, no humiliation, just an unreadable strength. Richard expected her to shrink under the weight of public embarrassment, but she remained composed. The humiliation he intended did not reach her, yet the weight of the moment pressed heavily on the room. What he did not expect, however, was a towering figure stepping through the restaurant doors. Barron Trump had arrived, and the night was about to take a dramatic turn. The laughter still echoed to the grand dining hall, a cruel symphony of mockery that fed Richard Kessler's arrogance. He stood tall, smirking with satisfaction as Melania Trump remained composed under his humiliating taunts. He believed he had won, that he had reduced the former First Lady to a mere spectacle for the elite to gawk at. But then the air shifted. The restaurant's heavy entrance doors swung open with a quiet authority, and a towering figure stepped inside. Barron Trump. At 18, he was no longer the shy boy the world had once glimpsed in the shadows of his father's presidency. He had grown into a striking young man, his frame tall and imposing, his presence commanding an undeniable respect. Dressed sharply but effortlessly, he carried himself with a quiet confidence that was not yet hardened by politics, but strengthened by something far greater, an unshakable devotion to his mother. At first, Richard didn't notice him. He was too absorbed in his moment of triumph, too wrapped in his own arrogance. But the rest of the restaurant did. Conversations halted. Silverware clinked against plates before being set down in stunned silence. Eyes followed Barron as he moved with steady, deliberate steps toward his mother's table. By the time Richard finally turned to see what had drawn the attention of the entire room, it was too late. Barron stood directly in front of him. He was taller than Richard, his stature casting a shadow over the manager's smug expression. But it wasn't just his height that made Richard uneasy. It was a fire in his blue eyes, a quiet but unmistakable fury that simmered beneath the surface. "Apologize," Barron said, his voice calm yet unyielding. Richard let out a forced chuckle, trying to mask his sudden unease. "Excuse me," he scoffed, though the slight tremor in his voice betrayed him. Barron didn't move, didn't blink. His presence alone was suffocating, pressing down on Richard like an invisible force. The once confident manager swallowed hard, realizing that the tables had turned. The power he had wielded so freely just a moment ago was slipping away with every passing second. "You humiliated my mother in front of strangers," Barron continued, his tone unwavering. "You think there won't be consequences?" The weight of the moment settled over the restaurant like a thick fog. Guests who had laughed moments earlier now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some lowered their heads in shame, while others watched in awe, witnessing a young man stand up for his mother in a way few had ever seen before. Richard, desperate to reclaim control, let out another weak laugh. "Oh, come on, kid. It was just a joke. You people act like—" "Shut up." The words were spoken softly, but they sliced through the air like a blade. Gasps rippled through the restaurant. Richard's face paled. He had underestimated Barron Trump, and it was a mistake he would regret. A heavy silence gripped the restaurant. Every eye in the room was fixed on the young man who had just stepped forward, his towering presence impossible to ignore. Barron Trump stood firm, his posture straight, his expression unreadable, yet the fire in his eyes was unmistakable. The weight of the moment pressed against the walls, suffocating the arrogant smirks that had once filled the room. "Apologize," Barron repeated, his voice steady, controlled. But beneath it, there was an unmistakable edge. Richard Kessler, the restaurant's manager, let out a forced chuckle, trying to shake off the sudden shift in atmosphere. Just a moment ago, he had been the master of the room, the one wielding the power. Now, standing in front of the former First Lady's son, he felt something he hadn't expected, unease. An apology? Richard scoffed, his voice dripping with mockery. To her? He gestured toward Melania, who sat poised, her face calm but her eyes sharp. For what? A little joke. His words slithered through the air, but no one laughed this time. The room had grown too tense, too aware of the shift in power. Barron didn't flinch. His gaze remained locked onto Richard, unwavering. "You disrespected my mother," he said, his voice low, but carrying the weight of something unbreakable. "In front of strangers. You think that doesn't matter?" Richard crossed his arms, regaining some of his earlier bravado. He had spent years bending powerful people to his will, using words as weapons to belittle and control. He wasn't about to back down to an 18-year-old, no matter who his father was. "Oh, please," he sneered. "You think you can walk in here and tell me what to do? You might be a Trump, but that doesn't mean anything here." He took a step closer, narrowing his eyes. "You're just a kid playing hero. You don't have any real power." A murmur ran through the restaurant, an uneasy shifting of bodies and chairs. The tension was palpable, stretching so tightly that it felt like it might snap at any moment. Some guests lowered their eyes, unwilling to witness what was unfolding. Others leaned forward, captivated by the scene, watching to see if Barron would back down. But Barron didn't move. He didn't react with anger or reckless words. Instead, he simply stared at Richard, the intensity in his expression deepening. The silence stretched, growing heavier with each passing second. Then, in a voice calm but laced with quiet steel, Barron spoke. "You think I need power to do what's right?" His gaze never wavered, never faltered. "Respect isn't about a name. It's about how you treat people. And right now, everyone in this room knows exactly who the weak man is." Richard's smirk faltered. His confidence cracked, just slightly, but enough for everyone to see it. He had expected Barron to lash out, to make a scene, but instead, Barron had done something far more dangerous. The restaurant, once filled with hushed whispers and quiet clinking of silverware, had fallen into complete silence. The weight of the moment pressed against the walls like an invisible force, thick and suffocating. All eyes were fixed on the young man, standing tall in the center of the room, Barron Trump. His posture was steady, his expression unreadable, yet the intensity in his gaze was undeniable. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't threatening. He wasn't even angry. And that was what made him so terrifying. Richard Kessler, the arrogant restaurant manager who had a moment ago basked in the laughter of his cruel remarks, now found himself standing face to face with the one person he had never expected to challenge him, a teenager. But Barron was no ordinary teenager. He was calm, he was controlled, and he wasn't backing down. "You will apologize," Barron said again, his voice even, but there was no room for argument in his tone. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a plea. It was a command. Richard swallowed hard, forcing himself to scoff. "And what if I don't?" he challenged, though his voice lacked the sharpness it once had. Barron didn't blink. He took a single step forward, and despite the lack of aggression in his movements, the shift in his presence was undeniable. It was as if the entire room had shrunk around him, forcing everyone, including Richard, to acknowledge his control over the moment. The manager felt it. He could see it in the way the guests were no longer looking at him with amusement, but with something else. Disdain, disappointment, even fear. No one was on his side anymore. "I don't think you understand what's happening here," Barron continued, his voice still steady, still measured. "This isn't about power. It's not about politics. It's about respect. And you don't have any." Richard clenched his jaw. He had spent years controlling people, bending them with his words, manipulating situations to serve his ego. But now, In front of this young man, this boy who should have been easy to break, he was crumbling. The silence was unbearable. It stretched across the room like a heavy fog, thick and impossible to ignore. No one dared to move. No one dared to speak. Even the waiters, who had once bustled around the restaurant, now stood frozen in place, holding trays of untouched food. Richard opened his mouth to fire back, to regain some semblance of control, but nothing came out. He had no words, no witty remarks, nothing that could dismantle the unwavering force in front of him. Barron had won, without raising his voice, without making a single threat, without anything but the sheer weight of his presence. And Richard Kessler knew, in that moment, that he had made the biggest mistake of his life. He had made Richard look small. The once lively restaurant had fallen into an unnatural silence. Moment ago, laughter had filled the space. Cruel mocking, a symphony of arrogance orchestrated by Richard Kessler, the restaurant manager who had humiliated Melania Trump in front of his wealthy patrons. He had reveled in the power, basking in the attention as he tore her dignity apart with his words. But now, the atmosphere had shifted. The laughter had stopped. The air was thick with tension. Standing before him was Barron Trump, tall and commanding. Barron's presence was impossible to ignore. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He did not need to. His piercing gaze was locked onto Richard, unflinching, unreadable, yet carrying an intensity that sent a shiver down the older man's spine. "You will apologize," Barron said, his voice steady and deliberate. Richard forced a smirk, though his confidence was cracking. "Or what?" He sneered, trying to reclaim control he had lost. "You think you can walk in here and demand things just because of your last name?" Barron didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. The weight of his silence was far more powerful than any words could be. The restaurant guests, who had once laughed along with Richard, now sat frozen, their gazes shifting between the two figures at the center of the room. Richard could feel their eyes on him. He could feel the shift happening, the power slipping from his grasp. His own patrons, his audience, were no longer on his side. Barron took a single step forward, and despite the lack of aggression in his movement, it felt as though the entire room had shrunk. The air grew heavier, suffocating. The sheer force of his presence was overwhelming. Richard swallowed hard. "You humiliated my mother," Barron continued, his voice low but firm, controlled yet powerful. "You think that makes you strong?" He tilted his head slightly, studying the man before him. "No, it makes you small." Richard's smirk faltered. He tried to laugh, to shrug off the weight pressing down on him, but it was useless. The silence was unbearable. It stretched across the room, a suffocating reminder that he had lost control. The guests, the staff, the very walls of the restaurant seemed to be waiting, watching to see what would happen next. "You don't belong here." Barron's voice broke through the silence like a knife. Not as a leader, not as a man. Richard clenched his jaw, his hands curled into fists at his sides, but he couldn't bring himself to speak. There was nothing left to say. Barron hadn't shouted. He hadn't resorted to violence. He had simply stood his ground, unwavering, unshaken, and that alone had been enough to dismantle Richard's arrogance, to strip him of the false power he had wielded so recklessly. The restaurant was no longer his domain. It belonged to the young man who had dared to stand up for what was right. The heavy silence in the restaurant was shattered by the piercing wail of sirens outside. Blue and red lights flashed through the grand windows, casting eerie shadows across the elegant dining hall. Guests turned in shock, murmuring in hushed voices, confusion spreading like wildfire through the once lively space. Then, the front doors burst open. Uniformed officers stormed in, their presence commanding instant attention. The sharp sound of their boots echoed against the marble floors as they moved with precision, scanning the room before locking their eyes on the man at the center of it all, Richard Kessler. Richard, who had a moment ago stood with smug arrogance, now paled as reality dawned on him. He had expected to win this battle, to humiliate Melania Trump and bask in the laughter of his patrons. But now, all he felt was dread. "Richard Kessler," one of the officers announced, his voice firm. "You're under arrest for hate speech and public harassment." Gasps erupted from the guests. A woman near the bar clutched her napkin, her eyes wide. Some patrons exchanged uncertain glances, others instinctively shifting away from Richard, as if his downfall might taint them. Richard scoffed, forcing a smirk that no longer held its usual confidence. "Oh, come on," he sneered. "You can't be serious." For what? A few words. But even as he spoke, there was no laughter this time. No one stood in his defense. The guests who had laughed along with him now averted their gazes, ashamed to have indulged in his cruelty. Barron Trump remained still, his face unreadable, his towering presence unwavering. He didn't need to say anything. The mere fact that he had stood his ground was enough. The officers moved in, one reaching for Richard's arm. Instinctively, he pulled back, his bravado cracking under the pressure. "Wait, you can't do this," he protested. "This is ridiculous. This is my restaurant." But his pleas fell on deaf ears. The cold steel of handcuffs clicked around his wrists. A hush fell over the restaurant, the finality of the moment sinking in. Richard Kessler, once the untouchable king of his establishment, was now reduced to nothing. As the officers began leading him toward the exit, Richard's desperation flared. He turned, searching the faces of his guests, the very people he had entertained with his cruelty. "Are you just going to let this happen?" he demanded. "After everything I've done for this place?" But the guests did not move. Some lowered their heads. Others shifted uncomfortably. A waiter, who had previously been too afraid to intervene, now stood straighter, relief flickering in his eyes. No one was coming to Richard's aid. The door swung open, and as the officers escorted him outside into the flashing chaos of cameras and reporters, Barron Trump turned to his mother. "It's over now, Mom," he said softly. And for the first time that night, Melania allowed herself to breathe. Within minutes of Richard Kessler's arrest, the incident inside the upscale restaurant had gone viral. Videos captured by stunned guests flooded social media, showing the exact moment Richard humiliated Melania Trump, the way Barron Trump had confronted him with quiet but undeniable strength, and the final, shocking scene of law enforcement arriving to take the arrogant manager away in handcuffs. Twitter, Instagram, and news forums exploded. Hashtags like #RespectMelania, #Barron Trump stands tall, and #JusticeServed trended worldwide. Public opinion, often divided when it came to the Trump family, found common ground in admiration for Barron's courage. People who had once underestimated him now saw a young man stepping into his own, not as the son of a powerful figure, but as someone who stood up for what was right. The once prestigious restaurant, known as a gathering place for Washington's elite, now found itself at the center of a massive scandal. Reservations were canceled at an alarming rate. Online reviews tanked, with furious customers leaving one-star ratings and condemning the restaurant for allowing Richard behavior. "This is unacceptable," one review read. "No woman should be treated that way, especially in a place that prides itself on class. Boycott this place." The backlash extended beyond social media. News stations picked up the story, running segments on the restaurant's failure to protect the guest. Prominent figures, including politicians and celebrities, spoke out against the mistreatment of Melania. The owner of the restaurant, desperate to salvage what was left, quickly distanced himself from Richard Kessler. But the damage had already been done. As the scandal gained traction, more shocking revelations emerged. Christine, a former hostess who had worked under Richard years ago, came forward with a disturbing truth. "I was too afraid to speak up before," she admitted in an emotional interview. "But after seeing what happened to Mrs. Trump, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore." Christine revealed that Richard had a long history of mistreating employees, especially young women. Documents surfaced, emails, recorded conversations, and testimonies from other former staff members, exposing years of harassment, verbal abuse, and threats that had been swept under the rug. The restaurant, already struggling under the weight of public outrage, could not survive this revelation. Faced with lawsuits and plummeting revenue, the owner made an announcement. The restaurant would be closing its doors permanently. As the scandal unfolded, Barron Trump's public image transformed. He was no longer just the son of a former president. He was a symbol of quiet strength and unwavering integrity. His refusal to let his mother be disrespected resonated with people far beyond politics. Then, One final twist emerged, a letter from Richard Kessler himself. Written from his jail cell, it read, Barron Trump, I never thought a teenager would be the one to humble me, but after seeing the world's reaction, I realize now I was the weak one. I won't ask for your forgiveness. I don't deserve it, but I need you to know that I regret everything. Barron read the letter in silence. He knew Richard's apology did not erase the pain he had caused, but it proved one thing. Barron had won, not just through confrontation, but through character.